to counter the PRC's influence in our own hemisphere. I now recognize myself for an opening statement. China, in my understanding, is the greatest threat to the United States, or the greatest threat that the United States has ever faced. That's not fantasy, this is a fact. China is the second economic power behind the United States. Their GDP is now nearly 75% of ours, greater than Nazi Germany or Soviet Russia. They are the top source of spying and cyber attacks in the world. They have the worst human rights record in modern history, and they have brought military equipment and Marxist ideology to our shores. Today, I am here to announce that great power competition is back in the Americas. The hammer and the sickle has returned in full force, and the Chinese Communist Party's first order of business is to own Latin America, our backyard. Their playbook is accomplished in three ways: economically, militarily, and ideologically. Let's go to the economic front. In the last 20 years, China has secured a presence in Latin America through what we could call a Trojan horse strategy to become the #1 trading partner in our region. We have seen their tactics: low quality goods, slave labor, securing critical infrastructure in exchange for access, and destroying the environment at every opportunity with no remorse. Let me repeat it. Our hemisphere has been invaded by China, and they are now the #1 trading partner in the region. #1 trading partner in the region. 20 years ago, they traded $12 billion. 20 years later, last year, they hit $450 billion. That is a 3,000% increase, 3,000% increase. Right now, China has free trade agreements with Chile, Costa Rica, Ecuador, Peru, and another one with Uruguay is on the way. Specifically in South America, they have surpassed the United States as the top trading partner. What? And 10 years from now, everything indicates, if we continue with this trend, that Latin America, the trade with China will exceed $700 billion. That's only trade. And let's talk about loans. In the last 20 years, China has lent almost $150 billion to the region. And of course, they are doing business with our enemies, Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. 21 Latin American countries have signed onto China's nefarious Belt and Road Initiative, which is a pretty name for something that is very simple: to create infrastructure to dominate world trade. Today, they control key ports in Peru, railroads in Argentina, airports in Honduras, dams in Ecuador, factories in Brazil, critical minerals in Bolivia, creating a major security risk for us, the United States. Needless to say, they're bad actors with very bad intentions, and their only intention is to own power. Now, the military presence in our hemisphere. Cuba is hosting 4 Chinese spy bases to intercept United States communications only 90 miles away from our shores, because in Florida, the state that I represent, has 20 military bases, and this military base gives the ability to intercept communications. And they are also thinking, the Chinese are also thinking of creating a military base to house Chinese troops in Cuba. Chinese troops in Cuba, 90 miles away. All right, now let's go to Argentina. Right now, they operate a satellite space station which has the size of 400 football fields. And the worst part of it all is that the Argentinian government cannot even go in, because the trade agreement, or the agreement between both countries, does not allow the Argentinian government to go in and inspect what's happening in that military or that spy base. Venezuela. China sold to Venezuela $650 million in arms in the last 10 years, including VN-1 tanks and state-of-the-art radar systems. But the most serious threat, according to my understanding, is their ideology and information control. Their propaganda machine is brainwashing Latin American youth. There are 40 Confucius Institutes across Latin America dedicated to spreading their oppressive ideology, communism. They also want to control their phones. Huawei, their state-owned telecommunications company, operates in 20 countries in Latin America. In Brazil, Huawei controls 50% of the phone market. Not only phones, but they also want to control internet services. And why do they want to do that? Because communists silence anyone who gets in their way. I have just proven with few examples that China is on the offense while the United States is ignoring our allies in Latin America. Chairman Xi Jinping has made official visits to 11 Latin American countries, 11 times in the last 10 years. So if we sit back as the #1 force, military force in the world, we will watch in the next decade that Mandarin will replace English as the second language in Latin America. China's Belt and Road Initiative will overtake the USMCA trade deal. There will be a monumental Cold War-style military buildup in our backyard, and worst of all, communist censorship will overwhelm Latin Americans' democracies. So we must engage now as a country. Communism is on our doorsteps once again, and it's time for us to wake up. I'm just going to say a few words because these hearings are also watched in Latin America throughout our allies in the hemisphere, so I'm going to say a few words so our friends will know what we're thinking. A mis amigos en la América Latina, China se está metiendo en nuestro hemisferio como un caballo de Troya. Prometen progreso, desarrollo y riqueza. Pero ¿quiénes son sus amigos en el continente? Chávez, los Kirchners, los Castro y ahora Ortega. Estos son gobiernos que han llevado a sus países a la miseria. Rechacen la amistad con China por el bien de sus países, de sus hijos, de las futuras generaciones. Lidiar con China es pan para hoy y hambre para mañana, por el bien de sus hijos y de futuras generaciones. Los Estados Unidos sigue siendo, con todos sus defectos, el bastión de la libertad, el progreso y el respeto a la santidad del ser humano. Now I would like to welcome our guests and the witnesses, Mrs. Carrie Hannon. She is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of Western Hemisphere Affairs of the Department of State. Thank you for being here. I should have said hi to you before I started speaking, but they said that I needed to start the hearing, so thank you and welcome, and thank you very much for being here, answering our questions. And Milady Guilarte, whom I haven't seen in many years, good to talk to you again. She is the Deputy Assistant Administrator for the Bureau for Latin America and the Caribbean at the United States Agency for International Development. So now I think I'm going to give the opportunity for the ranking member, Mr. Castro from Texas, to say a few words. Thank you.
Thank you, Chairwoman, and thank you to our panelists also. Thanks for convening this hearing on the influence of the People's Republic of China in Latin America. And thank you, Ms. Hannon and Ms. Guilarte, for joining us today. We are by far the biggest economic and security actor in the Western Hemisphere, but we must recognize that countries have deepened their economic and political ties with the PRC, and our foreign policy must acknowledge that. As we have this important discussion about the PRC's influence in the region, I hope that our approach is one that respects the sovereignty and independence of the countries in Latin America and the Caribbean. We cannot repeat the mistakes of the 20th century, where, in the name of combating the influence of the Soviet Union, the U.S. perpetrated and enabled horrific abuses, including military coups d'etats and death squads. Make no mistake, I'm not saying that I support China's deepening engagement in the Western Hemisphere or that I want it to be successful. The PRC is enabling authoritarianism in countries like Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua. They are exporting surveillance technologies to deepen repression in those nations. They make false promises of investment that create and dash the hopes of those looking for prosperity. And Chinese fishing fleets, hundreds of ships, illegally fish in the waters of Central and South America and hurt the livelihoods of thousands. The United States must help our partners in our hemisphere in the face of the PRC's efforts. And there are a few principles that I would like to lay out in how we should do so. First, when we decide to oppose the foreign policy actions of China, we need to be specific about what we oppose and why those actions are not in the best interest of the people of the Western Hemisphere. If we oppose China just because it's China without being specific, our message will not be heard in Latin America. Second, we need to stand by our values when engaging with the region. During the Cold War, the U.S. backed many authoritarian leaders in our effort to keep the Soviet Union out of the Western Hemisphere. The brutality of these leaders' reigns is still felt today, just as the Soviet-backed regime brutality in Cuba continues to be felt today. Thousands of people still do not know where their parents and grandparents disappeared during the Pinochet dictatorship and so many others. People remember that their country suffered in part due to the actions of the United States, and that still matters today. Lastly, the United States need to prioritize the region in a way that we simply haven't in the past. In the last decade, China has significantly expanded its diplomatic presence in the hemisphere, including by opening diplomatic relations with Panama, the Dominican Republic, El Salvador, Nicaragua, and Honduras. Meanwhile, House Republicans have proposed significant cuts to our diplomatic programs in the Western Hemisphere, and we have a number of nominees that have cleared the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, but haven't had a vote by the whole Senate because of holds by Republican members of the United States Senate. That includes, for example, Mr. Roger Nihas to be ambassador to Barbados, Ms. Stephanie Siptak Ramnath to Peru, Mr. Art Brown to Ecuador, Mr. Dennis Hankins to Haiti, Mr. Toby Bradley to Guatemala, and Mr. Leo Martinez to be the U.S. Executive Director for the Inter-American Development Bank. These positions need to be filled immediately, and their vacancies are harming the United States, and they're harming the United States when it comes to our competition with China in the hemisphere. So we need these nominees confirmed and at their post, and we need to reject the serious cuts proposed by House Republicans to our diplomatic and development programs in the Western Hemisphere. And this week, we're on the verge of a shutdown of the federal government, and I need to raise this. We're competing with the hearts and minds of the people of the Western Hemisphere and speaking to the strengths of America's democratic system over China's authoritarian one. As we speak, our diplomats in Mexico City, Bogota, and Brasilia are sharpening their talking points to explain to the governments and the people of Mexico, Colombia, and Brazil the embarrassing reality of political dysfunction in the United States and in this building. If this government shuts down this weekend because of the demands of the far right in this Congress, it would severely undermine faith in the American democratic system. And I urge my colleagues who care about China's influence in the Western Hemisphere to think about that. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how we're currently working on those goals and what more Congress can do to support these efforts. With that, I yield back, Chairwoman.
Thank you, Ranking Member, and now recognize Ms. Hanna for her opening statement.
Thank you very much, Chairman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to testify on the department's efforts related to the People's Republic of China engagement in the Western Hemisphere. As Secretary Blinken has said, our strategic competition with the PRC represents one of the defining challenges of the 21st century. This challenge remains particularly important in our hemisphere. It requires close coordination with interagency colleagues, international organizations, and allies and partners around the world. Just as important, it requires strong cooperation between the administration and Congress, so I welcome continued engagement on these issues with the committee and the chance to be with you today. Our strategic goal remains to promote a more democratic, inclusive, secure, prosperous, and climate-resilient Western Hemisphere, aligned with U.S. values and interests. We advance a positive agenda for the hemisphere based on values we share with our partners: respect for human rights and diversity, democratic governance, inclusive economic growth and entrepreneurship, and the rule of law. Managing the strategic competition with the PRC in the Western Hemisphere requires long-term solutions, which include strengthening governance and democratic institutions, reducing corruption, and helping our partners build economies that attract more investment from U.S. businesses and trusted partners. All U.S. embassies in the Western Hemisphere have staff that focus on tracking and reporting PRC activities, and each country team seeks to advance a coherent interagency response to the challenges posed by the PRC. The department has 4 regional China officers based in the WHA region, each with deep expertise in the PRC, to support embassies and consulates in addressing these challenges. Our embassies and consulates have developed country-specific strategies to counter problematic PRC activity in more than 2/3 of the country in the hemisphere. The United States works with democratic partners from outside the hemisphere as well. European partners, Japan, the Republic of Korea, and Taiwan all promote stability and growth in the region. With 7 of Taiwan's 13 official diplomatic partners located in WHA, we remain focused on countering the PRC's campaign to induce these countries to switch recognition and squeeze out Taiwan from multilateral organizations. On the economic front, we focus on ensuring competitive and transparent investment environments that help level the playing field for U.S. companies. The United States remains by far the greatest source of investment and remittances for the region. We offer higher standard and transparently procured infrastructure investment alternatives that uphold labor, environmental, and social safeguards. They also foster inclusive growth in line with international best practices, including those initiatives like the Partnership for Global Infrastructure and Investment, Deal Teams, and the Blue Dot Network. We continue to respond to structural corruption problems by encouraging civil society, activists, and journalists to raise concerns with governments regarding opaque deals. On security, the proliferation of PRC-linked telecommunications surveillance equipment highlights risks to national security, human rights, and privacy. Many of our technical delegations and engagements have focused on ICT and cybersecurity, sectors for which an aggressive economic campaign by PRC-backed companies threatens free market access. Our robust foreign military sales programs far outpace the PRC and demonstrate that regional partners prefer to work with the United States. The department also works to counter PRC propaganda and disinformation campaigns in the region. The Global Engagement Center works specifically to address propaganda and disinformation. We build resilience through targeted support to independent civil society organizations and journalists. And by funding independent third-party research, we help shine a spotlight on PRC information manipulation. Public diplomacy also remains key to our efforts to counter the PRC. The American Space's network of 131 brick-and-mortar locations in the region are the U.S. government's primary in-country public-facing platforms to connect foreign audiences to the United States. Our American Spaces outnumber by a 3-to-1 ratio the Confucius Institutes in the region. While American Spaces provide open access to accurate information reflecting American values, including the promotion of democratic and civic engagement, the rule of law, and the protection of human rights, Confucius Institutes expand PRC cultural influence in the hemisphere and aim to send thousands of young people to the PRC on exchanges. Meanwhile, our American Spaces are hosting English language programs and exchanges and successfully reinforcing economic, commercial, cultural, and political engagement with the United States. These exchange programs ensure the United States is seen as a steadfast partner to the region by promoting academic ties and professional development opportunities, as well as building institutional capacity. This includes programs such as our Young Leaders of the Americans Initiative Fellowship, among others. YLI, launched in 2015, has since hosted over 1,500 young entrepreneurs, over half of them women, from 37 countries throughout the Western Hemisphere, collaborating with over 100 U.S. companies and organizations in 85 cities across 34 states. YLI promotes U.S. business models, increases trade, encourages job creation, and builds lasting and sustainable networks of young entrepreneurs and business and social leaders across the Western Hemisphere, including the United States. To conclude, as we work to compete with and counter the challenges posed by the PRC in the region, we are intently focused on promoting a more democratic, inclusive, secure, prosperous, and climate-resilient hemisphere, aligned with U.S. values and interests, so we can remain the region's preferred partner. That will remain our steadfast goal. Thank you again for this opportunity, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Hanna, and now recognize Mrs. Guiliarte for her opening statement.
Chairwoman Salazar, Ranking Member Castro, members of the subcommittee, good afternoon, muy buenas tardes. Thank you for the opportunity to discuss the way that USAID is responding to the PRC in Latin America and the Caribbean. The work to prevent the PRC from gaining hold in the region is personal to me. My family came to the US from Cuba when I was 9 years old. Like so many who fled here to escape communism, I know firsthand the type of corruption and tyranny that it fosters. And you have to look no further than many of the countries fueling the surge in migration, Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela, to see the influence of the roots of communism the PRC promotes. In my current role, I oversee our operations in countries where concerns about the PRC's growing footprint, predatory economic colonialism, unsustainable infrastructure, and security investments are warranted. Since launching the Belt and Road Initiative in 2013, the PRC has become the region's largest provider of official finance, offering more than $215 billion, largely for infrastructure projects that come with strings attached. The United States is not forcing countries in the Western Hemisphere to choose between the United States and the PRC. But at USAID, we offer them an alternative to the PRC's approach. And we are grateful for the support of Congress, like the Countering PRC Influence Fund, which allows us to offer our neighbors that clear alternative with an affirmative agenda based on our shared values. Our neighbors in the region recognize the difference. They see that more than 35% of BRI infrastructure projects have been linked to corruption scandals, labor violations, environmental hazards, and public protests, like the Coca-Cola Sinclair Dam in Ecuador, which was riddled with cracks, caused significant erosion, and came with terms that required Ecuador to hand over up to 90% of its oil production. Governments in the region are becoming increasingly aware of the downsides of working with the PRC. USAID tracks perception of the PRC across the hemisphere, and people's trust in the PRC has fallen by nearly 20 percentage points over the past 10 years, while trust in the US has risen about the same amount since 2019. So we work to take advantage of those changing dynamics. Our approach to mitigating the challenges posed by the PRC focuses on 4 strategic lines of effort. First, we help our neighbors strengthen their democratic institutions and the rule of law to show that democracies can deliver results. We invest in programs that strengthen checks and balances and support actors like investigative journalists who shine a light on the actions and motivations of the PRC and their own governments. Second, we focus on increasing our partners' economic resilience so they can rebuff external coercion. USAID works with governments and the private sector to create transparent, efficient public procurement systems that reduce corruption and expose the risk of PRC transactions. In the Dominican Republic, our work on procurement standards created the transparency necessary to prevent backroom deals that PRC was pursuing for Port of Manzanillo infrastructure projects. Instead, US and other non-PRC firms won tenders for construction with better terms and environmental safeguards. Third, we focus on creating secure digital ecosystems. USAID provides a secure alternative to the PRC digital investments in 5G technology and cybersecurity. In Jamaica, for example, we invested $3.5 million to strengthen the government's cybersecurity and provide trusted technologies to reduce vulnerabilities to cyber attacks that could expose data, grind operations to a halt, and jeopardize national security. And finally, we advance the transparent management of natural resources. By supporting climate finance partnerships like the Blue-Green Bank in Barbados that supports renewable energy and water conservation projects, we help our neighbors attract capital and reduce their reliance on PRC's finance for infrastructure and energy. In summary, we will continue to search for new tools and opportunities alongside our interagency and multilateral partners to provide what partners are looking for and outcompete the PRC. We thank Congress and this committee especially for your support as we work to tackle this challenge together. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mrs. Gularte, for your opening statement. Now I'm going to recognize myself for 5 minutes of questioning. And thanks again to both of you. Let me just start with you, Mrs. Hanna, and just have a few questions about different countries. Do you know how many countries President Biden has visited since he assumed office? He's been to 32 countries. And do you know how many countries in Latin America, or I should say in South America, he has visited? 0. 0. And do you know how many times, Chairman, Xi Jinping has visited South America 8 times. So what message do you think that sends to the region? I understand that you're telling me that you have great plans and wonderful ideas, but perception is reality. So if you don't go visit your neighbors, what does that say?
Thank you for the question, Chairwoman. I can say that the Secretary of State has traveled to the region 11 times in the last 2 years.
Yeah, but that's the Secretary of State, that's
It's
not the
Secretary of
President.
State. It is not the President, it is the Secretary of State, and he has deeply engaged in diplomacy in the region. Additionally, President Biden has met with numerous leaders at various events, including UNGA last week, where we are able to conduct important diplomacy.
Well, we're going to talk about how many Latin American presidents the President of the United States has invited to the White House, but I'm going to get to that later. Now, have you, as one of the top officials dealing with Latin America in the State Department, have you advised the Biden administration, hey, you have to go to Latin America?
I can offer that any regional bureau would ask that the president visit their region. Of course, we would love for the president, for the secretary, for every
And
principal.
why do you think, what makes you believe that he hasn't been able to go? I mean, we're pretty close.
Yeah, I can't speak to the president's travel schedule, but I can say that it's still a top priority.
But have you advised them regularly? Have you advised the White House to take that step, to visit Latin America?
We continually advocate for robust diplomatic engagement with our leadership in Latin America and
You
the
know
White
that
House.
there was a visit to Brazil and Chile for October, but the trip was canceled. Why? Why was it canceled?
Well,
Do you know?
No, I don't know. I'm sorry.
Well, you know why it was canceled? Because there's no interest. Because Chile is only 8 hours away and Brazil is 9, but that doesn't really send a good message. Now, let's go to Honduras. President Xiomara Castro is the wife of Mel Zelaya. Mel Zelaya was a friend of Fidel Castro and told Fidel, and we know this, that capitalism was the most repugnant system he knew and that he had a profound aversion to the United States. President Biden celebrated her election, Xiomara Castro, who is the actual president of Honduras, sending Vice President Harris to her inauguration. Something that this White House denied to President Lasso of Ecuador, President Chavez of Costa Rica, President Peña of Paraguay. Those 3 administrations are conservative. But Mel Zelaya's wife received the honor of having the Vice President of the United States at her inauguration. What do you think what type of message that sends?
I think that we engage with every democratically elected government. Our participation in the inauguration of Honduras demonstrates the incredibly important bilateral relationship that we have with Honduras, addressing a whole range of issues that they continue to work with us on, including migration.
I'm just asking you specifically, the White House sent the Vice President to Honduras, and it did not do that with Lasso in Ecuador, who's a conservative. It's very clear to see the difference in treatment to these 2 countries.
What I can say is just yesterday I participated in a meeting with the foreign minister of Ecuador as we signed a SOFA between the United States and Ecuador. So our robust diplomacy continues with all countries, regardless of travel. I think we demonstrate continued commitment to all of those countries you named.
Did you know that the president of Honduras was going to break relations with Taiwan and recognize communist China?
So I was in Honduras in 2022 raising the issue of the value of a relationship with Taiwan as a democratic partner to the region. Countries make their own sovereign decisions about the relationships they had, as Honduras did in this case. But we continue to advocate strongly for Taiwan to maintain international.
But they decided to part ways with Taiwan and embrace China. That has been decided already. And apparently we did not have any type of influence over her decision. Now, do you know that in Honduras, like you said, is such an important ally, so close to the United States, they have been implementing the Chavista agenda, meaning Venezuela's Chavez agenda, expropriating businesses, defending Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela at the United Nations. and creating something called the colectivos, which are a nefarious word because those are the gangs that are enforcing the socialist government agenda. Are you aware of that?
I can offer that we continue to engage with Honduras at the highest levels about all of the issues that you're raising.
And what do they say? What do they say back to you?
I cannot. I'm not in those conversations personally, but
do you think that you're making any inroads? Because it's very worrisome that Honduras, which is so close, and like you said, most of the migrants that are coming to the United States through Central America have to go through Honduras, and Honduras is really not doing anything in order to stop that flow. On the contrary, they are charging those migrants to make it easier, and the government doesn't have Honduras, according to our sources in Miami, the district that I represent, where we have hundreds of thousands of Hondurans. Now the government of Honduras is using the desire to come to the United States as a business proposition. Are you aware of that?
I am aware that Honduras continues to partner with us closely to address irregular migration. I know that we remain...
Partner with us. In which way they're partnering with us? If they're charging $25 for every migrant that goes from point A to point B.
I can't speak to that particular scheme you're describing, but I can say that we continue to work closely with the government of Honduras as well as the rest of the Central American countries to address migration and to find solutions to try and reduce the flow of irregular migrants. I will also offer that we remain the preferred partner of the Honduran people, and I think time will
of
tell.
course.
And I think
the
time
people
will
of
tell.
Venezuela and the people of Nicaragua and the people of Cuba. Of course, the people always side with the Americans. No doubt about it. But I'm talking about the people that make the decisions, the governments.
And we continue to engage with the government at the highest levels. We've raised our concerns about the switch to PRC recognition and the potential for, buyer's regret. We've seen other countries in the region switch recognition from Taiwan to the PRC, and we see how that plays out.
Now, I'm going to, I don't want to fatigue you. Let me go to Guatemala, next door neighbor. The Biden administration attacked President Giammattei for being too conservative. How do I know that? Because the president himself told me. He is on his way out. Everything indicates that Mr. Bernardo Arevalo is going to be the next president of Guatemala, and he has expressed interest to increase ties with communist China. Have you had any conversations with the president-elect about engaging with China and leaving Taiwan behind?
I have not personally had conversations with President-elect Arevalo, but I know that we are in conversation with the democratically elected president, and that Taiwan remains, promoting Taiwan as a responsible and democratic partner in the region is one of the topics of conversation that we have.
Thank you. I'm going to then stop my questioning. I'm going to give time and pass the time over to the ranking member.
Thank you,
Yield back.
Chairwoman. Well, I want to say first, thank you at USAID, at the State Department. Thank you for working with Latin America and hopefully with leaders who are on the left or the right, who are democratically elected. I think that we should respect the will of the people as long as the elections were democratic and the leaders are not brutalizing their people. Unfortunately, throughout Latin American history, not to mention world history, but there are times when there are leaders on the left or the right who have become authoritarian and have committed brutality. I see it less as a matter of ideology, and at some point, when a president or prime minister becomes like that, it no longer becomes about ideology, but rather just brutality and authoritarianism. I do have a question, but I think as we have these discussions, and obviously the Congress is very focused on China. We want the United States to prevail, to compete against China in different parts of the world, including Latin America, and win. We want to stop China's repressive actions and human rights violations. For example, what they're doing to Uyghur Muslims is an atrocity. But, I'm always, when I've spoken to folks in Latin America and others, once in a while, sometimes I feel like they may be feeling too polite to challenge us on it. But, I'll hear, well, the United States is one of China's largest trading partners. Really, you've got a communist country, and we are literally one of China's largest trading partners, which is enabling part of their success, including, in ways, the expansion of the Belt and Road Initiative. We also do a lot of trade with Vietnam, for example, which is a communist country. But on the issue of China, it's tough to. The reason I said in my opening remarks that we can't just say, don't work with China because it's China. Well, they would just put a mirror back at us and say, well, the United States is feeding the beast, so to speak, if that's your perspective. And how do you confront that diplomatically and at the same time, hopefully prevail in this competition? And then I wanted to ask, with respect to USAID and our aid footprint there, our initiatives, what do you see? So it's kind of two questions here, one for both of you, but what do you see as, from their development side, from their aid side, how is it different from ours, and how is it evolving, if it's evolving? So I open those questions for y'all.
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. Our model is very different, and that's very clear. We work through partnerships and values, not transactions. And just to give you a snapshot, for every dollar of foreign aid, PRC creates $9 of debt. I think it's very clear that our model is very different. And as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I think we're seeing buyer's remorse already in some of the countries that have already flipped to China. So that's, I think, a clear indication that that their model is not, what they're making it out to be. I think the fact that we provide the type of assistance that it's more sustainable in the long term, that it's more in line with our values, goes a long way. We have doubled down our efforts on supporting civil society, especially human rights defenders, those that are on the front lines on reporting the different violations and harmful impacts that are creating serious consequences, right? You have communities that have been displaced. So there are endless examples on how the investments with the PRC is creating negative impacts. We're also investing on transparent procurement systems to reduce corruption. The example that I mentioned in Dominican Republic is one. So that's one way where our money can go a long way. We also support improving the cybersecurity systems that protect against surveillance from foreign adversaries. Like the PRC, of course, we've done that in Jamaica. And again, the work that we've done with investigative journalists has really been effective to be able to call citizens' attention to a set of issues that either, again, environmental and financial dependency perils. So I think that model has been very clear, and that's where we're making our bet in the long term.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe a quick answer.
Sure. Quickly, I would offer that, the Secretary laid out the invest, align, compete model for how we're dealing with China. And I think, we focus a lot on the compete part, but I think the invest and align part matters, and that, we're not seeking to block China from the role that they play in the world, but we're trying to give options so that they're not forced to make opaque investment choices that might leave countries in debt. And it's important that we give that option, especially in Latin America. Thank you.
Thanks, Chair. You're back.
Now I will recognize Mr. Mark Green from the wonderful state of Tennessee.
Thank you, Chairwoman Salazar, and I thank Ranking Member Castro for holding this hearing. I want to thank you to our witnesses for being here today. If you thought COVID-19 was the deadliest disease to come from China, think again. Authoritarianism is far deadlier disease. Having killed hundreds of millions of people throughout history, and like COVID-19, it's highly contagious. I've spoken before the full committee about how the CCP's censorship regime has made its way to the United States through Hollywood, and even Biden's Defense Department agrees with me on that. Now we're faced with a much bolder and a far more dangerous case of authoritarianism infecting Latin America. The Chinese Communist Party has made it no secret that it's willing to export a particularly insidious strand of authoritarianism across the globe, and its preferred method is the Belt and Road Initiative. Using this initiative, the CCP is rapidly and aggressively spreading its malign influence in Latin America and the Caribbean. Not only does it allow the CCP to extend its dictatorial reach and plunge vulnerable countries into virtual indentured servitude, but it's also squeezing Taiwan out of the region. 26 of the 33 countries in the region now have diplomatic ties with China and have severed their relationship with Taiwan. Many of these same countries have military and security agreements with China, posing such a high risk that Southcom has concluded that the CCP now has not only the intent, but also the capability, and I quote, to eschew international norms, advance its brand of authoritarianism, and amass power, influence, and expense of the existing and emerging democracies in our hemisphere, end quote. The situation is no longer a mere future threat to the United States, it's a reality that we are now living with. It is China that is largely responsible for trafficking fentanyl coming into our country through the southern border. It is China that is sourcing Mexican cartels with the precursor chemicals that kill tens of thousands of Americans every year. It is China that is exploiting the unstable countries in Latin America and the Caribbean, and it is the same brand of CCP authoritarianism that is causing the mass illegal migrations into the United States in the first place. We cannot talk about the crisis at our southern border and the crisis of the leading source of death for American adults aged 18 to 45 without talking about the CCP's involvement. If we continue to ignore our allies in Latin America and the Caribbean, we will fully cede control of the region to a communist dictator, and more American lives will be at risk. The first phase of ensuring America's interests in the region are identical to the first phase of the CCP's involvement in the region, and that is economic engagement. China used predatory economic engagement to set itself up in the region, but we can combat it by genuinely investing in our partners and seeking mutual benefits. And that is why I introduced my nearshoring bill, which accomplishes three things. First, it pushes the CCP out of the region by re-engaging with our partners. Second, it rebuilds diplomatic ties and establishes regional stability, key prerequisites for prosperity. Third, it builds Latin American and Caribbean economies, provides job opportunities, thereby reducing mass migrations that overwhelm our southern border. And I'll just thank Secretary Blinken for actually his team helping me write that bill. China's growing influence in the region is good news for no one. China has and will continue to destabilize the region, keep these countries from becoming prosperous and independent, and turn them against the interests of the United States. We must not allow the CCP to continue its malign activities. To ignore our partners in the hemisphere is to ignore the critical realities that threaten our national security. Without quick and decisive action, the CCP brand of authoritarianism will metastasize. My first question is for Ms. Hannon. Have there been any attempts by the State Department to engage China regarding its supply of fentanyl precursors into the region? And if not, why?
Thank you for the question, Mr. Green. We have had successful cooperation with the PRC on counter-narcotics in the past, but we do need them to do more to disrupt illicit drug supply chains. You know, we approach the problem of fentanyl from several channels, including sanctions, which attack the cartels like the Sinaloa cartel.
I mean, we're back. I get the cartel piece, but has the CCP given you one piece of information or one piece of evidence that show they have decreased the flow from China to the Latin American area? I mean, the price of fentanyl on the street now is 1/3 what it was when Biden came into office.
Yeah, so Secretary Blinken actually launched the global coalition at the UN General Assembly last week, which has over 50 countries working globally to address illicit drugs, including fentanyl. We have engaged heavily diplomatically with the PRC. We have worked with them both at the diplomatic level, but also to address things like.
I get the engagement. Have they done one thing, given you one piece of information, helped in one way that has decreased the flow of fentanyl?
Well, I mean, I can't say the direct impact of a PRC action to decrease fentanyl, but I can say that we are partnering with them to address standards, customer recognition, manufacturing, labeling, and but they absolutely can do more. This is an absolute scourge, and the PRC has a role that needs to be addressed.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that last part. That's important admission. Thank you.
We now recognize Congressman Greg Stanton of the state of Arizona.
Thank you, Chairwoman, very much. The House Foreign Affairs Committee has already held several hearings regarding China's global influence, a topic that is critically important to my home state in Arizona. Arizona is a border state, and it is a thoroughfare for illicit fentanyl trafficked from Mexico, which is often manufactured using precursor chemicals shipped from China. So my questions will play a little bit upon Chairman Green's as well. But before we get to that, I do want to talk a little bit about budgets. As we're aware of how important it is that the United States continue investing in our relationship with Latin American nations so that we can work with our neighbors on critical issues like drug trafficking and migration. But we can also check the PRC's presence in our own backyard. That is a bipartisan goal. We've heard that today. We just need budgets that match the policy goal, budgets that match the rhetoric. Unfortunately, in the majority's proposed budget earlier this year, it would cut state and foreign operations budget a full 24% from what the president had asked for all the way back to 2009 levels. And of course, the world is very different than it was 15 years ago. Arizona is seeing increased numbers of migrants crossing our southwest border. But unfortunately, the majority want to cut funding for example, immigration processing centers in Colombia, Guatemala, Costa Rica that screen migrants before they get to our borders. The proposed continuing resolution that we will likely be voting on hopefully tomorrow, maybe Saturday. We don't know what day the CR is going to come before this Congress, would cut funding for 800 Border Patrol agents. And of course, a shutdown would be horrific, forcing Border Patrol agents to work without pay. All this would mean less support for border communities and would hamstring the federal law enforcement's ability to prevent drugs like fentanyl from being trafficked across our borders. Fentanyl is behind an exponential spike in overdose deaths in Arizona. We know China tragically plays a deadly role in this crisis, as an estimated 97% of fentanyl here in the U.S. is manufactured using precursor chemicals exported from China. You mentioned we're working directly with the PRC and through other multilateral organizations to put pressure on China to do more to crack down on the trade of precursor chemicals. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be working at this point. So I want to follow up with what Chairman Green asked. How is the Biden administration working with not only China, but the Mexican government to clamp down on the flow of precursor chemicals from China to drug cartels currently?
Thank you for your question, sir. We work with Mexico to target TCOs. As I mentioned, the Sinaloa cartel is one that we sanctioned via Treasury. We use the Fentanyl Sanction Act. They've sanctioned over 90 entities or individuals, many of which come from Mexico and over 20 from the PRC. We're cooperating with Mexico on the Bicentennial Framework for Security, Public Health, and Safe Communities. And in fact, next week we have the high-level security dialogue where fentanyl will be one of the topics we discuss. We're using every sanction tool we have. We're also working with the PRC. We also do diplomatic engagement. Our Bureau of International Narcotics and Law Enforcement puts combating illicit fentanyl and the precursor chemicals at the top of their list of things to address.
Switching gears, I'm very lucky. In my community, the Taiwanese Semiconductor Manufacturing Company is building a $40 billion manufacturing facility in Phoenix. We're supplying chips to the next generation of Apple iPhones. So the safety of the people of Taiwan, protecting democracy in Taiwan, protecting trade with Taiwan is critically important to the local economy in Phoenix. Thousands and thousands of jobs are being created because of that foreign direct investment by TSMC. And therefore, recognition of Taiwan is very important around the globe. Deputy Assistant Secretary Hannon, a number of South and Central American countries have switched diplomatic recognition from Taiwan to PRC in recent years. Honduras just switched earlier this years. You talked about it a little bit, maybe a little bit more now if you would. How can the U.S. preempt more countries from switching their diplomatic ties to the PRC, especially as we think about nearshoring parts of our semiconductor supply chain?
Certainly, thank you for the question. We have 7 countries in Latin America and the Caribbean who still recognize Taiwan. In all of our public and private discussions in the region, we continue to emphasize that Taiwan's relationships, both with countries that recognize them and that don't, are reinforcing the hemisphere's democratic values and supporting sustainable development. We continue to support the United States, supports Taiwan's robust and meaningful participation both throughout the UN system and the international community where appropriate, and we strongly are encouraging all countries to expand their engagement with Taiwan.
All right, thank you, Madam Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, and now I'm going to recognize Congressman Keith Self of Texas.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I want to comment on my colleague across the aisle's comments about the border. The border is lawless, and it informs a lot of my opinions about South America, Latin America as a whole. This administration makes no effort on the border. He considers this Congress irrelevant. He considers the law irrelevant, and the border shows it. I may end with some questions, but I hear your talking points and your responses, so I may have some questions at the end. My questions would be, but I don't want to spend a lot of time on them. Do you actually consider China as the greatest threat to the U.S.? Because I think there's ambivalent responses to that question in the Biden administration. But I do want to, before I do that, soft power must still be power. I wish we had a hard power balanced approach in this hearing, but we do not. So what sanctions have you put on nations that have removed recognition from Taiwan? What actual sanctions have you put in the soft power realm on the nations that have removed recognition from Taiwan?
Thank you, sir. We don't put sanctions on countries.
I suspected that would be
Those
the
are
answer.
sovereign decisions of nations to determine who they have.
And it's also in our best interest to make sure that they do not recognize Taiwan. The president has said, the way I understand the official position of the United States is that we will provide Taiwan the weapons to defend themselves. However, this president has said 4 times recently that we will defend Taiwan. So I don't see that in the official policy of the United States, so I'm not sure what to believe about the administration's policy. Do you actually want to counter China in Latin America, or do you simply want to have this soft competition? That would be a question. I'm not sure I see any efforts to actually counter China. We talk about it, but I'm not sure the efforts are there. Do you have any examples of how you have actually responded to China's involvement in Latin America as a whole? And what are the red lines that you have for their involvement in dual-use facilities? Do you have any red lines?
Thank you, Congressman, for your questions. I'll give you our perspective from a development perspective. Of the 7 countries that remain recognizing Taiwan and Latin America, we have seen and actually created valuable partnerships with Taiwan to be able to demonstrate why working with Taiwan in the countries where we are, it's worth the investment. I can give you examples from Paraguay, Guatemala, and even in the Caribbean, where investments in education, agriculture, food security, and women's economic empowerment has gone a long way. These are areas where the PRC has not.
Has it deterred any country from de-recognizing Taiwan?
Not de-recognizing.
Can you give me an example?
Not de-recognizing, we haven't, no.
Because there are nations that still recognize Taiwan. Has any of this, do you know of an example where a country has used your efforts, have persuaded them not to de-recognize Taiwan?
I can give you one concrete example. I recently traveled as part of my job because I think it's important to be in Washington, but it's just as equally important as to visit the region and our partners. I was just in Belize, a country where USAID does not have a presence. We're actually considering, in places where USAID does not have a presence, increasing our footprint or considering being there exactly for those same reasons.
Well,
the way that they have...
Well,
I can just give you an example. They have not recognized PRC. They're a strong partner with Taiwan, Belize. I had meetings with our counterparts, Taiwanese counterparts, while I was there, and there's definitely an eye-to-eye, same level approach to our development with the Belizean government, where they're not interested in PRC, and they're continuing.
Thank you. You used the term buyer's remorse earlier, and I don't see that in the move away from Taiwan in Latin America, because they understand how important this is. I hope they understand how important this is to the United States. I think the move away from Taiwan is a major indicator of the failure of our soft power in Latin America as a whole. Madam Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Congressman. And now we're going to begin a second round of questions, and I want to recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I want to go to 2 different countries and continue with you, Mrs. Hannan. Let's go to Argentina. You know that next month there are going to be elections, and everything indicates, we do not know, we can't control that process, but that everything indicates that Javier Milei will be elected the next president of Argentina. Milei is the opposite of Xiomara Castro in Honduras, and he has said repeatedly on many television interviews that he doesn't, I'm going to quote him, that he doesn't deal with communists, that the Chinese government kills people who want to be free, that he is going to break ties with Cuba, Venezuela, Nicaragua, and China, which I think there are policies that are actually pretty good for the United States' interest in the region. So my question to you is, if Milei were to win the presidency in Argentina, would you recommend to the White House to send Vice President Harris to attend his inauguration if he were to win the presidency? I understand that you do not control the president's schedule. I understand that you do not, but you are highly influential. The State Department sends a clear message to the White House as to what should be the right policies that we should pursue.
I can't predict who wins an election. I can say that we always engage with democratically elected governments for any country. So if Milei,
I'm saying it in case that were to be true, and Milei, who has those statements, has repeatedly shared with the press what his presidency will look like, what will the Biden administration do?
What I can offer is that our relationship with Argentina is incredibly important. I can't say who would attend the particular swearing in of a president. I don't think that necessarily predicts totally the importance of a relationship that we have. We have robust diplomatic engagement in a variety of scenarios. I will say that we will continue to work with Argentina who was elected.
You understand what I'm trying to say. The Biden administration has not shown the same respect towards those governments who are democratically elected, and they tended to be on the conservative side. They have not shown the same type of respect to those on the conservative as on the left. And I think that's very worrisome. So I'm asking you in this case, which the Biden administration has a new opportunity to demonstrate equality, equity, and diversity. Could you commit to the fact that the Milei, if he were to be president, deserves the same type of respect as Xiomara Castro?
I can commit to the idea that every democratically elected leader in Latin America deserves a robust diplomatic engagement with our government, with our current administration.
But they're not having it, because that's not the case with Dominican Republic. Was not the case with Guatemala. So all we're trying to find is the same respect for one side of the ideology as for the other. So, and you can definitely influence those decisions. Now, let's go to Cuba. Cuba is currently hosting at least 4 Chinese spy bases, 4. And now they're thinking about opening up a new base to harbor Chinese troops. Chinese troops 90 miles away from us. That's part of Project 141, which is a secretive project to have military bases all over the world. My question is, have you shared with the Cubans that it is unacceptable to the United States to have Chinese troops 90 miles away? Yes or no?
So our strategy begins with diplomacy, and we're engaging governments about hosting PRC bases at high levels, exchanging information with them. I would refer you to the classified briefing that you had or to ODNI for additional information, but I will offer that we have raised our concerns with the PRC at the highest levels, including when Secretary Blinken was in Beijing last, about Cuba.
All right, now that you said about the classified hearing that we attended, since we cannot share that information with the public, could you commit to publish an unclassified report of what the United States knows about the Chinese presence in Cuba, so we can share it with my constituency, which is the Cuban exile community in the United States?
I can take that back to my team to inquire. Thank you.
To inquire if you can publish an unclassified report.
I can take that back to my team. I can't speak to whether or not we can, but I'll take it back, absolutely.
All right, thank you. I yield back. And now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Castro.
Thank you, Chairwoman. You know, we're talking about China and competition with China. One thing that I didn't mention, hadn't addressed, was the success and the cooperation of our business community in Latin America. And, you know, Representative Self asked the question, well, you know, what are we doing to counter China? Well, one of the things that we've been working on is pressing them not to purchase and accept and integrate technology like Huawei into their infrastructure systems. That's an important counter that I know the United States is working on day in and day out. But I also want to make sure, and I know that we do it, but I guess partially in answer to his question is helping our businesses succeed. I do think, like I said, I think that there are ways in the world where China cheats on human rights, for example, and should be held accountable. Debt traps is another one. But there are other ways where they are competing against the United States and Europe around the world. And I believe that we need to compete with them, and I believe that we can beat them, that our businesses can beat them, that our systems, our aid system can beat them. So I think that's an important part. But I want to ask a question. I have about 3.5 minutes left on a separate topic, and that's the rise of illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing in Latin America and the Caribbean. It's a major concern that affects livelihoods and communities and labor rights, the environment, and regional security. And combating IUU fishing has been a priority for numerous Latin American countries and is a key policy framework of the Biden administration. Much IUU fishing is perpetrated by large-scale operations of Chinese fishing fleets, sometimes supported by ports financed by the PRC. I'm currently working on legislation to address this issue. Beyond supporting naval and military capacities, which I know falls under the DoD, Ms. Hannon, how is the United States addressing the challenges and impact of IUU fishing in coordination with our allies in the region?
Thank you so much for the question. I think IUU fishing is an incredibly important issue because it also resonates with Latin America because they see it as their resource. And so we do a lot of soft diplomacy. I don't know if I agree with the term soft, but we reach out, we draw attention to actions by the Chinese fleets. I know Southcom has helped to draw attention to what they're doing. I personally participated in a working group in Peru that brought together NGOs and the Peruvian Coast Guard and the American Embassy to talk about ways that we can address IUU fishing, where they launched a program that will focus on the impact that the fisheries are having, looking at the zero tolerance policy that the PRC has and holding them accountable to the same standards. We have a working group. We have the SAFE Act that we can use. We're deeply supportive of CMAR. That's one of the most important marine areas in the world in terms of being a fishery bed. We're looking at deep sea squid fisheries. We take the issue very seriously. We work on it with governments, but also with NGOs and with aid programs.
Well, thank you for that. Thank you so much for your testimony today, both of you. I appreciate it. I yield back, Chair.
All right, we're going to begin a third round of questions, and I recognize myself for 5 minutes. And after that, I'm not sure if a ranking member would like to continue, but let's just extract and just get more information out of you. And this question is for Lady Gillard, and thank you. I'm sorry that I couldn't talk to you before, but definitely we very much appreciate the fact that you're coming, and as a Cuban American, you recognize the threat of that communist ideology penetrating our hemisphere. This has nothing to do with political parties. This has to do with being an American and caring about the American values being carried into our backyard, into the hemisphere that we belong to. So thank you, milady, for being here once again. So I'm not sure if you know that that after Daniel Ortega came back from China, he started raffling off all expenses paid trips, all expenses paid trips to China for whatever Nicaraguan wanted to adopt that all expenses paid trip. And according to the Nicaraguan press, no one participated. I mean, it's really weird that if they're paying for your room and board and for your plane tickets to go to a country, that no one cares about it or no one has raised their hands. So that is very interesting. And everyone likes free trips. But according to the Nicaraguan press, I repeat, no one participated in this offering from the Ortega regime. You are, through USAID, in charge, you are in charge indirectly of the public diplomacy in favor of the United States. So we understand that Latin Americans like the United States a lot more than they like China, and this is a very good example. How do you think that, what else can we do in this Congress to help people like you take the message that we're still the best game in town?
Thank you, Congressman, for your question. You know, I think Nicaragua, and as you know the region really well, it's really hurtful to see how things continue to deteriorate. I mean, you saw INCAE, you saw the UCA organizations, people fleeing. Our investments are modest. USAID, all of our partners are not operating in Nicaragua no longer. So our investments have been to double down on ensuring that when there is an opening, that those that remain outside and continue to fight for a free Nicaragua one day are ready to do so. And I think that's really where our funding should continue to be focused on. There's a lot of work that's being done to continue putting a spotlight on the human rights violations that are happening in Nicaragua. We have, from USAID, worked very closely with interagency colleagues to ensure that our partners in the multilateral institutions keep a close eye on not approving any loans on Nicaragua. So it's a multi-pronged approach. I think development does play a role, and we flex our development muscle in supporting those that are fighting the good fight outside, but it also requires other institutions to play a role. I mean, there's regional financing institutions that keep giving them a lifeline, right? So
what do your people are telling you, people that are based in Nicaragua still, what are they telling you?
I think it's very obvious that the conditions, I mean, there is no closing of civic space. There is none, right? But our work is not focused inside of Nicaragua.
And that's very sad, the fact that the soft diplomacy is not in place right now in Nicaragua. What about Venezuela? Do we have any activity in Venezuela?
And we
the
have
USAID, do you have any programs? What type of participation are we having in Venezuela at this hour with the Maduro regime?
in Venezuela, and forgive me because I'm not as knowledgeable on Venezuela, I cover all of Mexico and Central America, but in terms of our focus, it's on the upcoming election, and I think that's where we're ensuring that there's fair and representation from opponents.
And now that you say that, I can then ask Mrs. Hannon. She is saying that the focus is on the coming election. There is a candidate by the name of Maria Corina Machado that everything indicates that maybe if the Maduro regime accepts free and fair elections, that she may be the next president. In which way we're helping the, let's say, the economic, the diplomatic forces, the democratic forces in Venezuela to help to give the opportunity to the Venezuelan people speak their conscience and not be suppressed by the Maduro regime.
I think you're asking, I mean, it is a top priority to support the free and fair election in Venezuela.
But in particular, the State Department's now, not so much USAID, but the State Department, what can we be doing right now in order to help those democratic forces in Venezuela?
Inside of Venezuela? I know
Inside Venezuela.
we continue to respect the will of the Venezuelan people in their efforts to support, to do free and fair elections. We continue to have some aid programs that provide food security and give opportunity for them to continue to live. But we're waiting for the Maduro regime to I don't want to say waiting. We're supporting the free and fair election process that's being administered between the opposition and the Maduro regime, and will continue to work in
But you know that he is not willing to help any type of program that involves
Yeah.
free and fair elections,
Yeah, he's a
or
regime.
help the opposition have any airtime or any type of support. So what can we do? The State Department, soft diplomacy. What are the activities right now happening?
We continue drawing attention to the plight of the Venezuelan people. We also support the Venezuelans that are outside of Venezuela that have had to leave because of the economic situation.
But in particular with the Maduro regime, do we have any type of contact?
I'd like to come back to you on that question. I don't have the answer right here. Sorry.
Please do. Because the Biden administration has been good to the Maduro regime, and when we're talking about oil purchases. So if we are good to them economically speaking, maybe they would be wanting to hear on the diplomatic side. So it would be very interesting to know what type of contact when it comes to helping those opposition forces are we having from the State Department. Thank you. Please get back to us. I yield back.
Thank you. Just one last question from me. I know some of the challenges USAID and state face in posing ourselves as an alternative to the PRC and our funding limitations and restricted presence on the ground. And so I wanted to ask y'all, can each of you speak to the challenges and barriers you're currently facing in developing sustainable and mutually beneficial ties with regional governments? And then what effect would the proposed cuts by the Republican majority have on these operations if they were to go through?
Thank you, Congressman. Any type of government shutdown or lapse in funding would cause a disruption to our presence in the region, I think. Basically, it would come down to ceding space to China because they don't have the same rules as we do. I think one important piece where USAID has been playing a critical role, given the migration and the influx of migrants that are crossing and fleeing, is the integration work that we have throughout the region. So any type of budget cuts would pose significant harm in the settlement of some of these returnees, and I think would result in an increased flows to our border. So that's definitely one direct impact that the budget cuts would have. And I think something else would be the human rights budget would be detrimental to protecting the courageous human rights defenders that are doing their work. So any pause would be harmful. So those are some of the things I could think of right away that would be impacted by any budget cuts.
I mean, I think she laid it out well. I would just add that, we have so many programs and projects that support the values that we share with the hemisphere. And we're trying to advance a positive agenda, and these programs take time and they're investments, and we want to see them continue.
Thank you. I yield back.
Right, so pursuant to committee rules, all members may have 5 days to submit statement, questions, and other materials for the record. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned. And once again, thank you for your presence.